brig which made 'em sheer off had the impudence to press another 5 of our men. That's how we reached to the chops of the Channel. 12 good men pressed out of 35, an 18-pound shot-hole close beside our rudder, our mainsail looking like spectacles where the Frenchmen had hit us, and the Channel crawling with short-handed British cruisers. Put that in your pipe and smoke it next time you grumble at the price of tobacco. Well then, to top it off, while we was trying to get at our leaks, a French lugger come swooping at us out of the dusk. We warned him to keep away, but he fell aboard us, and up climbed his jabbering red caps. We couldn't endure any more, indeed we couldn't. We went at him with all we could lay hands on. It didn't last long. There was 50 odd to our 23. Pretty soon I heard the cutlasses thrown down, and some one bellowed for the sacre captain. "Here I am," I says. "I don't suppose it makes any odds to you thieves, but this is the United States brig Bertha Auret." "My aunt," the man says, laughing. "Why is she named that?" "Who's speaking?" I said. 'Twas too dark to see, but I thought I knew the voice. "Enseigne de Versailles Estef Lestrange," he sings out, and then I was sure. "Oh," I says, "it's all in the family. I suppose you have done a fine day's work, Stephen." He whips out the binnacle light and holds it to my face. He was young Lestrange, my full cousin that I hadn't seen since the night the smack sank off Telscombe Tye 6 years before. "Whew! That's why she was named for Aunt Bertha, is it? What's your share in her, Pharaoh? Only half owner, but the cargo's mine." "That's bad," he says. "I'll do what I can, but you shouldn't have fought us." "Steve," I says, "you aren't ever going to report our little fallout as a fight. Why, a revenue cutter'd laugh at it." "So'd I if I wasn't in the Republican Navy," he says. "But 2 of our men are dead, d'ye see, and I'm afraid I'll have to take you to the prize court at Le Havre." "Will they condemn my baccy?" I asked. "To the last ounce. But I was thinking more of the ship. She'd make a sweet little craft for the Navy if the prize court'd let me have her," he says. Then I knew there was no hope. I don't blame him. A man must consider his own interest, but nigh every dollar I had was in ship or cargo, and Steve kept on saying, "You shouldn't have fought us." Well then, the lugger took us to Le Havre, and that being the one time we did want a British ship to rescue us, why, o' course we never saw one. My cousin spoke his best for us at the prize court. He'd owned he'd no right to rush alongside in the face of the United States flag, but we couldn't get over those 2 men killed, d'ye see, and the court condemned both ship and cargo. They was kind enough not to make us prisoners, only beggars, and young Lestrange was given the Bertha Auret to rearm in the French Navy. "I'll take you to Boulogne," he says. "Mother and the rest'll be glad to see you, and you can slip over to Newhaven with Uncle Auret. Or you can ship with me, like most of your men, and take a turn at King George's loose trade. There's plenty pickings," he says. Crazy as I was, I couldn't help laughing. "I've had my allowance of pickings and stealings," I says. "Where are they taking my tobacco?" 'Twas being loaded on to a barge. "Up the Seine to be sold in Paris," he says. "Neither you nor I will ever touch a penny of that money." "Get me leave to go with it," I says. "I'll see if there's justice to be gotten out of our American ambassador." "There's not much justice in this world," he says, "without a navy." But he got me leave to go with the barge, and he gave me some money. The tobacco was all I had, and I followed it like a hound follows a snatched bone. Going up the river I fiddled a little to keep my spirits up, as well as to make friends with the guard. They was only doing their duty. Outside of that, they were the reasonablest of God's creatures. They never even laughed at me. So we come to Paris by river along in November, which the French had christened Brumaire. They'd given new names to all the months. After such an outrageous silly piece of business as that, they wasn't likely to trouble themselves with my rights and wrongs. They didn't. The barge was laid up below Notre Dame Church in charge of a caretaker, and he let me sleep aboard, after I'd run about all day from office to office seeking justice and fair dealing, and getting speeches concerning liberty. None heeded me. Looking back on it, I can't rightly blame 'em. I'd no money, my clothes was filthy mucked, I hadn't changed my linen in weeks, and I'd no proof of my claims except the ship's papers, which they said I might have stolen. The thieves! The doorkeeper to the American ambassador, for I never even saw the secretary, he swore I spoke French a sight too well for an American citizen. Worse than that, I had spent my money, d'ye see, and I took to fiddling in the streets for my keep. And a ship's captain with a fiddle under his arm, well, I don't blame 'em that they didn't believe me. I come back to the barge one day, late in this month Brumaire it was, fair beazled out. Old Mannion, the caretaker, he'd lit a fire in a bucket and was grilling a herring. "Courage, mon ami," he says. "Dinner is served." "I can't eat," I says. "I can't do any more. It's stronger than I am." "Bah!" he says. "Nothing's stronger than a man. Me, for example. Less than 2 years ago I was blown up in the Orient in Aboukir Bay, but I descended again and hit the water like a fairy. Look at me now," he says. He wasn't much to look at, for he'd only one leg and one eye, but the cheerfullest soul that ever trod shoe leather. "That's worse than 111 hogshead of baccy," he goes on. "You're young, too. What wouldn't I give to be young in France at this hour? There's nothing you couldn't do," he says. "The ball's at your feet. Kick it," he says. He kicks the old fire bucket with his peg leg. "General Bonaparte, for example," he goes on. "That man's a babe compared to me, and see what he's done already. He's conquered Egypt and Austria and Italy, oh, half Europe," he says. "And now he sails back to Paris, and he sails out to St. Cloud down the river here. Don't stare at the river, you young fool. And all in front of those pig-jobbing lawyers and citizens he makes himself consul, which is as good as a king. He'll be king, too, in the next 3 turns of the capstan. King of France, England, and the world. Think of that," he shouts, "and eat your herring." I says something about Boney. If he hadn't been fighting England I shouldn't have lost my baccy, should I? "Young fellow," says Magnan, "you don't understand." We heard cheering. A carriage passed over the bridge with 2 in it. "That's the man himself," says Magnan. "He'll give 'em something to cheer for soon." He stands at the salute. "Who's t'other in black beside him?" I asked, fairly shaking all over. "Ah, he's the clever one. You'll hear of him before long. He's that scoundrel bishop, Talleyrand." "It is," I said, and up the steps I went with my fiddle, and run after the carriage, calling, "Abbe, Abbe!" A soldier knocked the wind out of me with the back of his sword, but I had the sense to keep on following till the carriage stopped, and there just was a crowd round the house door. I must have been half crazy, else I wouldn't have struck up, "Si le roi m'avait donné Paris la grande ville." I thought it might remind him. "That is a good omen," he says to Boney, sitting all hunched up, and he looks straight at me. "Abby, oh Abby," I says, "don't you remember Toby in 118 Second Street?" He said not a word. He just crooked his long white finger to the guard at the door while the carriage steps were let down, and I skipped into the house, and they slammed the door in the crowd's face. "You go there," says a soldier, and shoves me into an empty room, where I catched my first breath since I'd left the barge. Presently I heard plates rattling next door. There were only folding doors between, and a cork drawn. "I tell you," someone shouts with his mouth full, "it was all that sulky-ass Say's fault. Only my speech to the 500 saved the situation." "Did it save your coat?" says Talleyrand. "I hear they tore it when they threw you out. Don't gasconade to me. You may be in the road of victory, but you aren't there yet." Then I guessed t'other man was Boney. He stamped about and swore at Talleyrand. "You forget yourself, consul," says Talleyrand, "or rather you remember yourself, Corsican." "Pig!" says Boney, and worse. "Emperor!" says Talleyrand, but the way he spoke it sounded worst of all. Someone must have backed against the folding doors, for they flew open and showed me in the middle of the room. Boney whipped out his pistol before I could stand up. "General," says Talleyrand to him, "this gentleman has a habit of catching us canaille and dishabille. Put that thing down." Boney laid it on the table, so I guessed which was master. Talleyrand takes my hand. "Charmed to see you again, Candide," he says. "How is the adorable Dr. Pangloss and the noble Huron?" "They were doing very well when I left," I said, "but I'm not." "Do you sell buttons now?" he says, and fills me a glass of wine off the table. "Madeira," says he, "not so good as some I have drunk." "You mountebank," Boney roars, "turn that out!" He didn't even say man, but Talleyrand, being gentle-born, just went on. "Pheasant is not so good as pork," he says. "You will find some at that table if you will do me the honour to sit down. Pass him a clean plate, General." And true as I'm here, Boney slid a plate along just like a sulky child. He was a lanky-haired, yellow-skinned little man, as nervous as a cat, and as dangerous. I could feel that. "And now," said Talleyrand, crossing his game leg over his sound one, "will you tell me your story?" I was in a fluster, but I told him nearly everything from the time he left me the $500 in Philadelphia up to my losing ship and cargo at Le Havre. Boney began by listening, but after a bit he dropped into his own thoughts and looked at the crowd sideways through the front room curtains. Talleyrand called to him when I'd done. "Eh, what we need now," says Boney, "is peace for the next 3 or